This is Mark Mullinax, and I welcome you back to Power for the Peaceful, a podcast and class on Taoism. Today, bonus episode 3, the Tao Te Ching we almost never knew.
When you listen to the ground and you put your roots down, you can hear what she says if you're listening. When you listen to the ground and you put your roots down, you can hear what she says if you're listening. The sweet sound of the river as she moves over the stones. The same song that the blood in your body sings as it weaves around your bones. When you're listening, are you listening?
This bonus episode focuses on how Taoism intersects with concepts like feng shui, traditional Chinese medicine, martial arts, and yin-yang exercises. But reading only a Tao Te Ching text, one may never, ever see these intersections. So I'll begin with a difficult statement. My translating Tao Te Ching and our privileged ability to read now over 100 various Tao Te Ching translations in English are all accidents of history, and not all that Taoist. Our notions of what Tao Te Ching is are quite unalike to how Taoists in China today have known it for 2,000 plus years. Taoists in China do not isolate the Tao Te Ching as we in the West have done for the past 200 years. We see this scripture as a standalone, as heavily philosophized, a text best read alone or in a classroom, and a text antiseptically scrubbed clean of its colorful history and popular Taoist sentiments. That is, we practice a kind of text fundamentalism. Westerners reading just Tao Te Ching get no sense, none whatsoever, of the numberless ways that this most essential Chinese wisdom text has emerged from and become integrated into the popular mind throughout Chinese history. When we read only our 100 translations of Tao Te Ching, we read something more at home in a museum about China than learn how to live in the Chinese environment that produced not just Tao Te Ching, but an entire holistic spiritual scaffolding or library of practices and customs.
When you're listening, are you listening? When you're listening, are you listening?
Chinese cultures and spiritualities emphasize life's holistic nature. Every single particle or thing seen in Tao's light emerges from and shines light on an integrative whole, and that whole supports every part. Chinese religious practices are ever intermingled with politics, economics, educational concerns, and what happened yesterday. So Taoist life encompasses not just commitment or belief to a text or teaching, but also practices of that belief, which together form a unified and not to be separated yin and yang process that unites internal roots and external branches of Chinese life some 2,500 years ago. Because China is Tao's first home. You and I are guests at best. Every English version of Tao Te Ching is a translation pulled from its Chinese context and arbitrarily adapted into our own. Even with my current translation, I pretend, wink wink, Tao Te Ching can stand alone without scaffolding reference to pre-existing works such as the I Ching, the Chinese classics of history and poetry, the Confucian Analects, books of ritual, Sun Tzu's The Art of War, and all their commentaries. Each of these also have centuries of finely tuned practices and rituals associated with them each, and share sensibilities and commonalities with Taoist texts and understandings. But do you know of Tao Te Ching text that brings such things out? So, how did we get here? How do we begin to isolate one thread of Chinese life and culture, Tao Te Ching, And how did we get to this privileged place where we learn to ignore the rich historical context that produced Tao Te Ching in the first place? We begin with thanking Matteo Ricci, 1552 to 1610, Common Era, an Italian Jesuit missionary, often received in the course of the Chinese royalty. He dedicated himself to making Christianity appetizing to the Chinese intelligent classes, or intelligentsia. But, enamored as he was with Chinese wisdom traditions, he rendered the upper classes' versions of, quote, Chinese wisdom, unquote, palatable to his peers in the West. Ricci's legacy was furthered by Scottish sinologist and missionary James Legge, Legge, 1815 to 1897, who performed for a curious, searching, and philosophically minded West the service of isolating the Taoist text we now know as Tao Te Ching as a standalone work. It was esoteric enough to lure the curious and translatable enough to persuade a non-scholarly but inquiring Western mentality that this exotic text was all we need to know about Taoism. It's as if Legge brought home one beautiful bird from China and housed it in a zoo where many people came to see, report about, and even make popular this one imprisoned bird for the masses. And we could live and die convinced that this one bird is all we need to know about Chinese exotic birds. Translated more than any other sacred text save the New Testament, Tao Te Ching's history in the West is a curious isolation of one text scraped clean of its historical influences. Our notions of Tao Te Ching are rarely bothered by conversations with Confucianism, the Chinese poetry tradition, the various Chinese dynasties in the past 2 millennia, and even Mao Zedong during the 20th century. If we read Tao Te Ching only as a, quote, timeless text, unquote, we will know very little of Taoism's long lineage or the times, traditions, rituals, and worldviews that produced it. Of course, one may read translations of Tao Te Ching with great profit for personal growth and living intentionally. I do and you do. However, if Tao speaks to you, I hope you sink roots into Taoist traditions themselves, get to know the cultures that began and then shaped the first understandings of Tao. Learn other Taoist priorities besides the practices of silence and non-competing. Find out if there's a Taoist community or center in your area. Come to realize that even without an equivalent to a pope or a Mecca, millions regularly still take part in Taoist activities and rituals. And what's more, many of these millions may not even own a copy of Tao Te Ching.
When you're listening, when you're listening, are you listening? When you're listening, when you're listening, are you listening?
Dear listener, when we each came to learn how good Tao Te Ching is or was, we may have read or interpreted like a foreign, exotic thing. Perhaps we tend to glorify a text, but pay little attention to the myriad of ways it came to us. We may consult Tao Te Ching like we consult a compass to show the way north. But do we know where we are on the map? What also is going on here is that in every faith or spirituality with a written text, non-textual and lively practices emerge that are kind of tied to the text, but not explicitly in the texts themselves. For example, the word Christmas is not in Christian literature. But imagine how life would be without a Christmas season. Christians also have many reminders about how life is sacred, enemies are for loving, and forgiveness is their first duty. But Christians are some of the first to go to war and hold views that are not charitable to others. I know. I've been a Christian. So there's divergences between text and practices. So every faith has a written tradition. This is how things are and should be. But that written text is surrounded by a cultural and spiritual scaffolding or tradition. This scaffolding supports how that written tradition is to be interpreted, remembered, and what's most important in the living out of that text. This spiritual scaffolding occurs in every culture in which folks bring religious or spiritual mindsets into everyday rituals and activities so that one is rarely aware of when one is more text-based or when one is engaging in a more cultural expression of the text, kind of like Christmas. So how does Taoism and how do Taoists actually live out of their text? Long before there was a Tao Te Ching, there are many variations of Taoism and understandings of how to live Taoism out. You might call these Taoisms. Taoism has always been a way of life, a worldview, and practices about the way, the path, or Tao, to align oneself with the way the universe has always operated. Taoism contains many practices that have arisen from Chinese culture, practices which became connected then with Tao Te Ching's teachings. However, each cultural practice is rooted in a distinct time and place, whether that time and place is 20th century Los Angeles or certain mountainous areas of 16th century Ming Dynasty China. These practices are far-ranging. They guide the ways one journeys through time by observing the calendar year. They include rituals of balance and alignment, of healing, of dietary customs, of balancing one's life, of balancing that life with one's spirituality, just to start a list. So Taoism is a spiritual and yet always historical anthology of walking the way during one's life. Taoism is not so much things to know and to believe, as some religions tend to become, but ways of intentional life and paths of wise living that harmonize with one's environment and fellow passengers on this planet.
When you're listening, are you listening? When you're listening, are you listening?
Without a contextual or historical understanding of Taoism, we will miss out, for example, on how popular Taoism emphasizes healthy lifestyles for long life, or that food is considered as much medicine as it is nourishment, and that whatever one consumes either preserves or drains the body's energy, or qi. We'll miss out on the centuries-old quests Taoists have had for immortality. So what follows in this episode are some of the things we might miss if we only read Tao Te Ching in English, isolated from Chinese concepts. In the Taoist calendar, there are major festivals, some of which last for days, from 2 to 3, up to 7 days or more. A relatively simple 2-day service may involve 15 different rites or acting out activities that correspond to distinct texts, with each rite lasting perhaps several hours. Typically, each of these rites consists of these stages. First, purification, and then invocation of the deities, then prayers, consecration and offerings, hymns, dances, and prescribed ways to move and to walk. Taoist rituals are colorful, filled with music and chanting, incense, and very stylized movements. None of these rituals are treated in the Tao Te Ching, but some emerged in the earliest pre-Tao Te Ching cultures of China, and were grafted onto the Taoist roots as new branches of the Taoist tree. There are Taoist funerals and veneration rites on behalf of ancestors, some of which are performed only by Taoist participants, and at other times performed in collaboration with Buddhist priests. There are also rituals on behalf of local communities, rites that may happen only once in 3, 5, or even 12 years. Such rituals first seek to sacralize or cleanse the ritual space, and also include periods of ritual fasting, offerings, dances, and then end with rituals to return that ritual space to its ordinary uses. Only certain people can perform these rituals, with the majority of participants serving as spectator participants. These few performers invoke prayers and practice ritual motions to bring in the so-called heavenly bureaucracy to oversee and bless that time and space. At other times, these performers act like shamans who ascend to the heavens in a trance to become one with the heavens and bring heaven's words and wisdom back to the human context and even to exorcise bad spirits on earth. Barefoot Taoist masters walk beds of hot coals, or mount ladders made of sharp swords, or pierce themselves with sharp objects. In some rituals, Taoist masters call on the powers of local spirit generals and spirit armies, and, in a reenactment drama of a Taoist or folk story, invoke these spirits' powers on behalf of a local community's aid and protection. Sometimes these shamanic rituals include communication with the dead, a ritual in which a human being, representing a Taoist immortal or deity, is carried in a sedan chair by two people. This representative of a god, through movement and word, then dictates responses to settle conflicts between the members of the community, whether such members are dead or alive. Much of Chinese drama is influenced by Taoist ritual. Puppet theater especially has roots in Taoist ritual and continues to portray Taoist principles in key ways, including the consecration of the participants before the show begins. It may also include the presence of water and other appropriate talismanic symbols. The master puppeteer occupies the center stage, just like a Taoist master when presiding over a ritual. One ritual I love is the ceremony for yin and yang. Yin-yang is yet another one of these cultural ideas, an idea rich in other than Taoist Chinese cultural and spiritual histories, and is mentioned only once, again, just once, in the Tao Te Ching, verse 42. But the sense of yin-yang is deep in cultural behavior and rituals. Taoists practice a form of yin-yang ceremony when it becomes obvious the earth or an environment seems to have come off its axis, say after the 2011 tsunami in Japan, or a weather disaster, and people are plunged into suffering and misery. This ceremony does not have to happen on the actual site of a disaster or by the suffering people themselves, but can be an intercessory ritual held anywhere by Taoists in order to ritually contact the heavens, harmonize yin and yang, pray for good weather, and a harmonious society. Other applications of Taoism in everyday life, which most of us recognize, include the Taoist concepts of feng shui, traditional Chinese medicine, qi or energy regulation, and of course, martial arts. Let's go through these each. Briefly, feng shui is an ancient Chinese art of arranging buildings, objects, and interior spaces in an environment or way to achieve harmony and balance in ways that bring peace and prosperity. Feng shui means the way of wind and water, and is still today a sort of divination about how energy flows in a space like nature. So to practice feng shui is to arrange a room, a house, or a campus of a temple so that the natural qi or energies are not blocked but flow freely. Traditional Chinese medicine, or TCM, is thousands of years old and has changed little over the centuries. TCM is based upon the idea that one's vital life force, or the same qi as in feng shui, flows through one's body. Any imbalance to qi can cause illness and disease. TCM generally feels this imbalance comes about by an unnatural alteration in the balance of yin and yang, or the complementary forces that make up qi. The Chinese worldviews nearly always assume that humans are microcosms of the larger surrounding universe and are interconnected with nature and subject to its forces. So balance between health and disease is a key concept. TCM treatment seeks to restore this balance through treatment specific to an individual. TCM practices a Taoist belief that to regain one's balance, you must re-achieve the balance between the internal body organs and the external elements of earth, fire, water, wood, and metal. Treatments to regain balance may involve acupuncture, the burning of herbs on or near the body, cupping, or the use of warmed glass jars to create suction on certain parts of the body, massage, herbal remedies, and movement to foster concentration exercises such as Tai Chi. Now, if you like the weird and the bizarre, Taoism has even been weaponized. See in the show notes my blog post when I lived in South Korea. In the first half of the 20th century, when Japan was the imperial occupying force in Korea, the Japanese cast about for more than just a military or political domination, but sought a crushing spiritual advantage over the Koreans. Using huge, very long metal spikes like an acupuncturist would use her needle, Japanese buried these spikes in what they considered the spiritual backbone of Korea, in the ground, as a way to block Koreans' feng shui and native qi, so Korea would have little or no power to oppose Japanese aggression. These long spikes angered Koreans when they were discovered and are regarded to this day as a form of spiritual terrorism. See my show notes for my spiritual terrorism post. Martial arts are well known today, but how many are taught as Taoist expressions? Do you realize that the Do in Taekwondo, Judo, Aikido, Hapkido, Kendo, and Bushido is the same Chinese word as Tao, or the way? These are ways of activity that mimic the energies of qi and water. At their heart, martial arts are not aggressive activities to eliminate enemies, but rather movement exercises of the individual to learn how the flow of Taoist qi is like unto water, until in one's movement one is water, moving and acting in a most Taoist efficiency. Well, we could go on and on. Taoist rituals cover the entire waterfront of a Taoist's life. Taoist rituals celebrate deities' birthdays, invoke repentance, venerate nature, mimic water or the stars above, practice Thanksgiving, celebrate Lunar New Year's Day, weddings, and even more. I've included a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy that the curious listener will do well to click if you want more. So for us North Americans, our vulnerability is that we might see only the single Tao Te Ching philosophical stoical star, and yet miss the larger Taoist constellation of practices containing Chinese medicine, feng shui, the search for immortality, martial arts, and even enhanced sexual energy, which I did not discuss today. For more, check out the show notes again for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Taoism is no different than any other faith. Taoism is alive still, and its texts, spiritual foundations, histories, and traditions are all alive, conversing ever with their cultures that leave their thousands of fingerprints on the text itself. And Taoism has multiple, diverse ways to express one's adherence to this faith, or to get one more aligned with Tao. Finally, a plea. Come to Taoism for its philosophy, yes, but stay for its rituals and practices. Tao Te Ching and the multitude of Taoist rituals and cultural expressions are hardly antagonistic components, but themselves share a yin and yang balance, a recipe of historical teachings about Tao and significant practices of Tao. Tao Te Ching teaches balance and harmony. Taoism teaches how to practice balance and harmony. Taoism is a philosophy and has many a welcome and home around the world. You can talk with and talk back with this rich tradition, for Taoism is both a library and a community. This podcast is about Taoist philosophy, and we'll be back again next week to treat verse 21. However, the diverse and many spiritual ways Taoist communities practice a balanced life are beyond the descriptive ability of a 25-minute podcast episode. So this podcast remains an original labor of love, designed, written, and co-produced by many whose central idea is that Tao Te Ching text and Taoist practices are good news for today. Tao still speaks. Artist Audrey Davis performed this podcast art. Molly Hartwell sings for us. Fortress Press holds the copyright for any use of my Tao Te Ching translation. Thank you for your attendance in this class on Taoism. May your days begin in peace, and become practices with which you weave radical hope for you and your communities.